Okay, hi everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. My name's Jess. I'm the education assistant with EKISC. And today we're going to be talking about invasive plants 101. So just some basics, why we care about invasive species, what we can do to stop the spread of invasive species, and then we'll go into some basic ID. So to start off, I just want to acknowledge that EKISC operates and all of us who work at EKISC live and work on the unceded lands of the Ktunaxa and Secwepemc people. I'm currently in Fernie and it's just so beautiful out. So nice to have so little smoke out that you can really see the mountains, and I just feel super grateful to be here. So I hope that you all feel super grateful to be wherever you are as well. So a little bit to start about the Invasive Species Council. So we're a nonprofit organization. We're formed in 2008. We help coordinate invasive species plant management and mitigation strategies across the region. We work with a cross-section of stakeholders who are united in their efforts to effectively manage invasive species. So we're not land managers, but we do coordinate a lot of land management on public land. We have a wide variety of funders for fieldwork and for our education team. And we have a regional focus that includes education, outreach, training, management coordination, and fieldwork. So we have a mandate to protect the region from invasive species, both land-based and aquatic, though terrestrial plants are our specialty for sure. So to start off, we have some terminology here. So that we'll be talking about throughout the webinar today. So first of all, we have native species. A native species is one that's evolved with the ecosystem. They can be spotted by their usual lack of monocultures. They live in harmony with the plants and the animals around them. So ecosystems are dynamic. They may appear homogeneous depending on their stage of growth, but for the most part, you can spot a forest of native species by the fact that there's lots of different species around. It also includes the area that they could spread with natural dispersal methods, which is an important distinction to make. So we have invasive species from all over. They can be from different continents, different parts of the country. And they can also be from different parts of the province. If it's not within their natural dispersal methods, they won't be counted as native. Our next term is non-native. So that's everything living outside of its native distributional range, which is arrived there by human activity, either deliberate or accidental. So non-native species that have been introduced by humans. They're usually introduced or planted for some use. Though they're not native to the ecosystem, the habitat is preferable for them. So for example, I'm from the west coast of BC, and the climate there is very similar to a Mediterranean climate. So lots of the plants that grow in a Mediterranean climate are able to grow on the west coast as well. I have pictured here tomatoes and dandelions. Dandelions used to be considered invasive, but are now recognized as a very low priority non-native plant because though they do take over an area, they don't cause any crazy harm to the ecosystem, and they can actually provide benefits for humans and livestock as food and fodder. So all parts of dandelions are edible, and they have some health benefits and food benefits as well. And though they do take over an area, lots of times they're taking over lawns and things that are already non-native. They don't tend to take over native biodiverse forests and things like that. Other terms for non-native that we might come across include alien, introduced, exotic, and ornamental. Oops. And then we have invasive. So when a non-native species causes economic, social, and or environmental harm, we consider them invasive. So all invasive species are introduced from somewhere else, but not all introduced or non-native species are invasive. So we can kind of think of two circles of invasive or of native species and non-native species, and then invasive species would be a smaller circle within non-natives. And then our last term here is noxious weeds. So noxious weeds is a term used by the BC Weed Control and Act and Regulations. It's an invasive species that's been designated by provincial authorities as one that is injurious to agriculture or horticultural crops, natural habitats, or human and wild livestock. Sorry. So a noxious weed designation basically just allows for more funding for specific plants to be removed. So we want most invasive species to be labeled as noxious because it helps us to mitigate their spread. And lots of the ones that we really focus on are labeled noxious. Okay, so some invasive impacts. These are kind of what we call the big three. So we have economic harm, environmental harm, and cultural harm. So economic harm, economic impacts of invasives in Canada and BC are officially unknown. They're changing all the time. In BC for 2020, the estimated cost against invasive species was $139 million. And the estimated annual lost revenue in the agriculture and forestry industries in Canada is $7.5 billion per year. So really important impact that invasives have. We as a council would not exist without invasive species, and we have people we have to pay. There's people that go out and remove invasive species, people that monitor for invasive species. So a lot of money goes into mitigating invasive species. There's also environmental impacts of invasive species. So habitat loss or degradation, water quality and quantity, they threaten biodiversity, they can introduce disease, they can alter fire regimes. They can cause a lot of damage to the environment around them. And then cultural impacts. So they can reduce land and recreation opportunities. They can result in income loss, reduce property values. If there's plants growing through your foundation or through concrete, which they can do, can reduce the property value of your house. They can increase control and management costs. And also there's export and import restrictions on different kinds of plants. So lots of cultural impacts as well. For example, the region of the Okanagan spends millions of dollars, approximately $17 million in the past 5 years on treating just Eurasian water milfoil in Okanagan Lake. And that's just one kind of invasive species that they're dealing with. So can really cause a lot of problems. According to the World Conservation Union, invasive alien species are the second most significant threat to biodiversity after habitat loss. And lots of invasive species can cause habitat loss as well. So they're a really big problem. In their new ecosystems, invasive species can become predators, competitors, parasites, hybridizers, and diseases of our native and domesticated plants and animals. They can alter habitats and essential ecosystem functions like hydrology, nutrient cycling, contaminant absorption, natural fire regimes, and energy flows and cycles. They can place other ecosystem functions at risk, like absorption of greenhouse gases in forests, pest control by native species, water filtration by wetlands, and the use of native biodiversity for the bio-based economy, including like biotechnology, things like that. It often takes several years before the extent of the problem is recognized, and then it can also take several years for the problem to be eradicated. It's often not a one-time job. We're having to go back to sites over and over again to continue to pull invasive species and make sure that we're not leaving any behind. And they've caused the extinction of over 110 vertebrate species around the world and have affected nearly every type of ecosystem. So I mentioned that they're the second most significant threat to biodiversity, or other threats to biodiversity include habitat loss, changes in land use, overexploitation, and climate change. But of those, invasive species is rated at number 2. So pretty big deal. So some notes on habitat loss. There's three major kinds of habitat loss. We have habitat destruction, habitat degradation, and habitat fragmentation. So habitat destruction, the iconic image of like a bulldozer knocking down trees is what we can think of for habitat destruction. Some invaders, though, can physically alter the habitat in a way that can be considered habitat destruction. So our example of this is 50 beavers in 1946 from Canada were relocated to Tierra del Fuego, which is an archipelago in the southern tip of South America, to be hunted for their pelts. And since then, they've multiplied into the hundreds of thousands. So because these trees in this region are not adapted to beaver activity as they are in North America, most of them don't grow back after being gnawed by beavers. So these beavers have had a crazy impact on this environment in many different ways. They create dams that make stagnant water, that change the nutrient cycles in forests. They also build dams in drainage ditches of grasslands, and livestock can commonly fall into them. So we're not the only ones that are affected by invasive species. We also send some of our native species away to different areas where they become invasive in different parts of the world. The next type of habitat loss is habitat degradation. So that's pollution, invasive species, and disruption of ecosystem processes are some of the ways that habitats can be so degraded that they no longer support native wildlife. So this is basically making the habitat less livable for our native species. It's not completely destroying it, but it is significantly altering the quality. And then we have habitat fragmentation, which we can think of like roads, trails, anything that splits a habitat into different distinct areas. We're really bad about this in North America. Invasive species do this less than humans do. They're more likely to contribute to the first two, but they still can have an effect on habitat fragmentation as well. This can make it difficult for migratory species to find places to rest. Yeah, really big problem that we have here in North America. Just one other term that I'll go over because it describes invasive species really well is we can talk about generalist versus specialist species. So a generalist species is a species that thrives in a wide range of environments and has a very non-specific diet. So I usually think of species like raccoons who can adapt to many environments, climates, and food sources. They're sort of a jack of all trades species. And generalist species include invasive species. So this is what makes them so successful. They are super adaptable. They can live anywhere and they like really disturbed areas. And then to contrast that, we have specialist species, which have a limited diet and they occupy a narrow niche. So an example of these is the giant panda, which requires specific parameters and a diet to survive. Their diet is only bamboo, and they can only survive in like a very narrow, narrow niche of temperatures and environments and climates. So if invasive species were specialists, we wouldn't have to worry about them as much, but they are generalists. So we have to recognize some of the characteristics that these generalist species have in order to understand invasive species. So here are some of the main characteristics of invasive species. This webinar is going to be a lot of information. You don't have to remember it all by any means, but if you do remember anything, I would suggest taking notes on these because it'll just let you notice invasive species around you. Even if you don't know what the plants are, you can notice the characteristics of these plants and maybe have a better idea of whether they're invasive or not. So invasive species lack their natural predators, pathogens, and diseases, and this is basically what makes them invasive. This allows them to outcompete native species that have been evolving with the ecosystem for a long time and it promotes the formation of monocultures. So in their native environment, they have predators and competitors and diseases and things that help their populations be kept in check. And when they don't have any of those, they can explode into a huge population. They also have easily spread seeds, either by wind, water, animals, or clothing. Related to this, they are generalist plants that quickly establish and thrive, often in disturbed areas. And they're also prolific producers and reproducers. They can spread quickly, provide large amounts of seeds per plant, and the seeds can remain viable in the soil for years or decades for some plants. So the last 3 points there are not specific to invasive species. They are all general plant characteristics, but when they're added all together, they are what make invasive species so prolific. So some other characteristics related to those last ones: they outcompete native species, they thrive in disturbed areas, form monocultures. Their seeds can remain viable for years, sometimes up to 60 years, so years to decades. Even if you don't see invasive species around, doesn't mean that they're not there and just haven't germinated yet. They also have phenotypic plasticity and allelopathic traits. They're two buzzwords that you can add to your Scrabble repertoire. Phenotypic plasticity just means that they're adaptable to a wide range of conditions. They tend to be habitat generalists, as I said, so they don't have specific or narrow growth requirements. They can adapt to all kinds of different things and survive in a wide range of environments and climates. They also might have allelopathic traits. Not all invasive species have this, but allelopathy basically just means that there's chemicals in the plant's roots that can leach out into the soil and kill their surrounding neighbors. So in their native range, these plants with allelopathic traits might have evolved with plants that have defenses to these chemicals, but when these plants are transported somewhere else and planted somewhere else, the plants around them don't have any defenses to these chemicals, and they're super effective on these plants. We also have here, they might have longer photosynthetic periods. So they're often the first to leaf in spring and then the last to drop leaves in autumn. Just gives them a lot of time to spread around. So monocultures are something that form with invasive species. If you see a field that's completely one color or looks like a lot of the same kind of plant, you might be looking at a field of invasive species. So it creates a lack of ecosystem biodiversity, a loss of food sources and habitat. Monocultures are also apparent in Western farming, is another place you might have heard of them. In these cases, it introduces diseases and a lack of resilience and biodiversity as well. So when you have all one kind of plant in an ecosystem, it basically opens up that ecosystem to pests and diseases and can cause all kinds of problems. Whereas in a polyculture is the opposite of monoculture, where there's lots of different plants and lots of biodiversity. There's more areas where that pest can be eradicated or can stop, where diseases can kind of get run out because there's more biodiversity, and that just makes an ecosystem more resilient. So you might have seen monocultures if you are in the East Kootenays. I live in Fernie and have to drive to Kimberley all the time. The rest of our team is in Kimberley, so I drive through Jaffrey all of the time. And if you've driven through Jaffrey in like July to early August, you've seen all the fields of blueweed of Jaffrey. It's pretty, but all invasive. So invasive species are super opportunistic. They thrive on disturbance and often are, you can find them in super disturbed areas. So some of these areas might be trailheads, roadsides, highways, gravel pits, cut blocks, dog parks, anywhere where humans are kind of trampling the ground a lot, or animals too, maybe in pastures. You might see them in your neighbor's yard. They thrive on disturbance. So disturbed area means less resilience, and it means that they can establish quicker. So a little note on their reproduction and spread. So plants can spread either by seeds or by vegetative reproduction. And vegetative reproduction is a process where plants are produced from plant parts other than seeds or spores. It's a natural process that many plant species have, and it's used by horticulturists all the time. You might have used it if you have ever broken off a little piece of a succulent and planted it and created a new plant, or broken off a piece of your house plant and put it in water for a while its roots grow, propagated a plant. That's vegetative reproduction. So it's great for lots of plants, but when invasive species can do it, it makes it really hard for them to remove them, for us to remove them, because any piece of plant, of root or stem that's left in the ground can sprout a whole new plant. Some examples of vegetative reproductive structures are rhizomes, which you can see in this top photo here. They're the underground stems. They're kind of a mix between stems and roots in plants. And then stolons, which are similar, but they're stems that run along the surface of the ground. And new plants can develop from either of these. They can also disperse great distances if they're moving down a stream, if the plants are near water and their seeds can float or their plant parts can float. Any fragmented plant part can travel downstream and form a new colony farther away. Seeds are another way that plants reproduce. All plants, or most plants, reproduce by seed. And lots of invasive species have different various means of dispersal that makes them more efficient at dispersing. So some seeds are light and feathery and can be carried long distances by wind or water. You'll see this with cottonwoods in like June or July, when the sky kind of looks like there's just cotton floating everywhere. That's cottonwood's dispersal method of their seeds. So they're really good at transporting by wind. Other seeds are prickly, sticky, or tasty. So they can be transported by attaching to animal fur, animal feet, humans' clothing or boots, and they can be transported around that way. Some seeds, like those in tasty fruit, can pass through an animal's digestive system and be pooped out somewhere else to form a new colony. So tons of different ways that plants can reproduce and spread. So how can we prevent the spread? These are just some of the campaigns that we work with at EKISC. So on our small scale, the spread of invasive species is preventable, and prevention is like our #1 defense against invasive species. It's much easier to prevent them from coming in than it is to remove them once they've established. So play, clean, go, clean, drain, dry. These might be things that you've heard before if you are a recreationalist and enjoy the outdoors in the East Kootenays. So brushing our boots before we leave a site, after a hike or camping, brushing off our gear, making sure that we're not taking any visible or invisible plant parts and seeds with us to the next place that we go. You can also help by not letting your pets loose. This is how goldfish have become an invasive species, is by people letting their goldfish loose in lakes and streams, thinking that that's a humane way to let them go. If you're a pet owner, it's not humane to let them out in our waters. They can cause a lot of damage. Buy it where you burn it. We do have a campfire ban on now, but when we don't, some invasive species can travel to different parts of the province or the world in firewood, dead wood. And then once they're burned, animals like gypsy moths will lay their seeds in dead wood. And then once they start to burn, they'll be released. So that's an invasive species that we don't want around. And then plant-wise is the last one here. This is just planting native species in your garden. So lots of invasive species have come as ornamentals because they're pretty and they're planted in people's gardens, and then they tend to take over. As well, lots of wildflower mixes contain invasive species. So it's super important to put some pressure on your plant stores and make sure that you can get native species for your gardens. So here's some of the management techniques that we use at EKISC. Some of them you can use as well. So our first one is mechanical. This is used in riparian zones and other areas where herbicide is not an option, but also just in general, this is what we do. This includes weed whacking, mowing, cutting, pulling weeds, and clipping them. It's a viable option for you in your garden if the plants have a taproot, which is kind of like a really thick root that comes down. I always use the example of carrots and parsnips. The actual part of the carrot that you're eating is what the taproot is. It's like a thick root that anchors the plant down in the soil, and then fibrous roots will come off the side of it. So some plants have this, and if they do, they're an easy plant to pull. You also have to be careful with mechanical pulling if the plants spread by vegetative reproduction, because as we talked about before, if you're leaving even a little fragment of a root, it can grow a new plant. So good thing to be careful about. We also have cultural management techniques. So this includes like using livestock and goats to eat plants. It also includes revegetating or seeding with native species after you've manually pulled plants. So this is often combined with manual treatments. Goats and other animals can be trained to be selective. So there's a woman, I think she's based in Kimberley, but she travels all around with this herd of goats that she has, Kiwi, with Fahana goats. And her goats are trained. They eat blueweed, they eat knapweed, and I think mullein, and maybe a couple others. Yeah, but they can be trained to be selective for invasive species. So it can be super useful when combined with manual treatments as well. Chemical. So this is the most effective method that we use to control invasive species. And it's definitely a controversial one. I was skeptical about it when I first started as well, using herbicides. I'm a plant lover, so I can see how it is a bit iffy, but when we have large quantities of invasive species, it's definitely our most effective method. We use different compounds for different species, so which is something that I didn't know. So we'll have a type of herbicide that if we spray it over a whole field, it's targeting one specific plant and won't do anything to the rest of the plants. So it's definitely our most effective cost and removal wise defense. Biocontrol, this is a cool one. It's used on small patches and it doesn't always eradicate the plant. It usually just contains it. But biocontrol is basically introducing a native predator of that plant or species to come in and basically do the work for us. So because we're introducing a new species into the ecosystem, it takes a long time to test. The classic example of minimal testing is the cane toads in Australia. So there was farmers that had the sugar cane that was going crazy in Australia. So they introduced these cane toads that eat the sugar cane to try and control the population. And these cane toads just went crazy. And now you can't take 2 steps in Australia without seeing a cane toad. So they take a long time to test, up to 10 years, because we are introducing a new species. So we want to be super careful that that's not going to become invasive as well and cause even more problems. And then education, which is, in our opinion, our #1 defense against invasive species. So we can coordinate with community groups and organizations, hosting weed pulls, restoration projects, any like interpretive signage that you see, all contributes to community building. Community events can create lasting effects as well. So the fact that you're all here listening to a webinar and learning about invasive species means that maybe you'll go out on a walk tomorrow and see an invasive species and pull it, you know, it just, everything helps. Yeah, people learning about invasive species is super radical and amazing for us and really helps to mitigate the spread of invasive species. So even if it feels like just an hour that you're killing, you are really helping our ecosystem. So a little note on our integrated management. This is just how we create our priority lists. So we have these things called invasive plant management areas, or IPMAs. We have this list that we coordinate with the province to update on each year. Different plants take differently to different areas, and our region has a lot of diverse microclimates. It's a big region, it covers a lot of area, and not all areas are going to be equal with the priorities that we have and the plants that we are managing for. So because of this, we create these IPMAs. We have this map, and then for each of these IPMAs, we have a plant priority list. So this is kind of a heinous document. You don't have to remember this. I just wanted to include it to show you how we manage our area. So we have our high priority plants, which are the ones that either aren't present yet or are present in very low quantities, in the red up there, all the way down to established. It is #4. So these are widespread species, and there are lower priorities unless they're causing significant damage to an area. So it's definitely site specific, but having these plant priority lists in each of our IPMAs just helps us to create different priorities for different plants in different areas, and helps us to be the most efficient that we can in how we're dealing with them in each different region. So what to do if you suspect that you see an invasive species? So we suggest that you be suspicious of plants that seem to pop up out of nowhere or form monocultures. Also to take just 5 minutes to look at it and see if it matches with anything from your ID resources if you have them with you, or to take a picture of it and look it up later is super helpful. We usually say if it grows like a weed, it probably is a weed. So just to be suspicious of the plants that you see around your area, and just start to really look around you and notice the land that you're on. And what to do if you find invasives. So we suggest that you report them using the Report Invasives app, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And to remove them if you have the means to do so, if you know the pulling technique, or if you know that this plant can be pulled, and you happen to have gloves with you. It's always super helpful to just remove invasive plants that you see, or to send us a picture of them or report them using the app and come back to them later. It's just super helpful for us to know where they are. We're a really small team, and we can't get to every corner of the region. So we definitely rely on people reporting them to us so that we can get our priorities together. So this is what the Report Invasives app looks like. I suggest that everybody download it. I have one more app suggestion as well, but this one is definitely super useful for us. So this is the Provincial Public Reporting System for Invasive Species. It used to be called Report-A-Weed. And report a weed is getting is no longer going to be in service by the end of the summer, I believe. So report invasives is the one to download for sure. You can look up plants by flower color, common name or Latin name, and it just asks you to take a picture of the plant, select the area of infestation, so how big the infestation is, and include your contact info. And all of these reports go to a woman named Judith. She's lovely. She lives in Victoria, and she confirms the plants and then sends them to us. And this is one of the really big ways that informs where our field team is going to pull plants, where we are focusing our efforts on. So if you see an invasive species and can report it, that is super helpful for us. You can use it as a tool to identify, though I don't find this app very user-friendly for that. So for ID, I recommend using iNaturalist. This is not an app that we check at EKISC, but it's super useful for identification. So it's a citizen science app that lets you upload photos from your phone or take a picture straight in the app, and then has an algorithm that suggests an identification for you based on what flora is reported around you and what looks visually similar. So your initial ID can be something really simple. If you're really not sure, it can be something as simple as like flowering plants. And you can upload that, and then it's available for researchers and for citizen scientists to see your observation and suggest IDs for it if they think they know what it could be. So it's totally community-based, and your observations can become research grade observations and be used for all kinds of different research, which is super cool. It helps researchers and land managers, and it also just allows you to explore your local area. So you don't even have to upload them if you don't want to, but it's a really useful tool for identification. So I highly recommend iNaturalist. It also makes it so you don't have to have a bunch of ID books with you all the time, or if you just come across something when you don't have your books on you. Okay, so we're going to start with a little bit of ID. I only have a few plants here, but they're just some of the common plants that we see around the East Kootenays. So I thought I would add a little bit of basic identification here just so you can see them and maybe put a name to a face if you've seen these plants before. So the first one we have here is blueweed. Blueweed has a blue, purple, or pink flower on it. The stems can be up to 90 centimeters tall, and the stems have red or dark spots on them. The stems are also covered in these stiff hairs, which make them a little bit irritating to pull if you have sensitive skin. So we always recommend having gloves with blueweed. The basal leaves and the rosette down here are quite long, and then they get much slimmer towards the top. So this is the plant that I was saying is all over Jaffrey. There's lots in Kimberley as well. This one is all over, and it's pretty much done blooming now, but in like end of July, beginning of August, you'll see it everywhere. Our next one here is a very common one around our region. This is spotted knapweed. So spotted knapweed has one flower head on each of these little bracts, and the bracts have this dark spot on them, these dark spots on them, which is an identifying feature. They can grow up to 120 centimeters tall and are super branched. So when you see a big infestation of them, they'll kind of look like this picture on the left here. The leaves are finely divided into these little segments, and they have a taproot as well. I don't know if I mentioned that blueweed has a taproot, so it can be pulled too, but this one does as well. So definitely pullable. It only reproduces by seed. So as long as it's not in seed, or you're being very, very careful with the flower heads not to like shake them around, it's definitely a good one to pull. And won't reproduce if you leave a little fragment in the ground. This is also an example of one of the allelopathic plants that I was talking about before. So sending chemicals out into the soil to kill the surrounding plants. So this one is a big deal for us. These two are the same genus, but they're two different plants and two different priority levels here in the East Kootenay. So one is orange hawkweed and the other one is yellow. Yellow hawkweed is quite common around our region, and orange hawkweed is much less common. It's a pretty high priority plant for us, actually. There's about 28 different types of hawkweed found in North America, and about half of them are native. So good to double check these plants in your ID books or in iNaturalist to make sure that it's the right one. But the yellow hawkweed is pretty common, so you'll see it pretty often. They grow to be about 30 to 90 centimeters tall, and they have these flowers just right at the top. They have bristly hairs all up the stem and shallow fibrous roots. So this one is not a good one to be pulling out. It's very difficult to get the entirety of the plant and can actually make it worse, make the infestation worse through pulling. You can sometimes get away with pulling if they're like in this rosette stage, in their like very, very early stages. But even then, you probably will have to be coming back for years. So chemicals are definitely the best option for this plant, or what we use, at least the most effective option. The next one here is Canada thistle. So despite the name, this one is invasive. It looks very similar to bull thistle, which is also pretty common. I personally see Canada thistle more. It has these clusters of pinkish purplish flowers on the top. They're sometimes white, but they're at the top of branches and have a sweet vanilla smell. So they smell kind of nice. The leaves are about 5 to 15 centimeters long, and they have spines and prickles on the surface of them. So you've definitely felt these ones before. They have woolly hairs underneath the leaves as well. We can dig small patches of these, and there actually is a recently approved biocontrol weevil for these that has shown some promise, but Canada thistle is pretty widespread across our region and the rest of BC as well. The next one here is burdock. So burdock is a member of the sunflower family. You can kind of see the resemblance in the leaves. It has these giant leaves. It starts out looking like rhubarb. In its first year here, you can see it doesn't have the stem, and then in its second year, it'll shoot up this bolt. It can get really tall. It can grow between 1 and 3 meters tall. I've definitely seen ones way taller than me. The flowers are pretty tiny and they form these burrs. These are often what you'll be like pulling off your pets if you're going for a walk, or pulling off your clothing, your hiking pants maybe. The leaves are huge. They can be up to 50 centimeters long and 30 centimeters wide. So it doesn't really look like anything else that we have in our region. It can sometimes be confused with balsam root, but they don't really grow in the same areas. So you'll see this in, again, a lot of disturbed areas, along trails, along sidewalks, things like that. This one has a large taproot, and the root and the stem are actually edible. This is something I learned this year, that the inner stem, before it flowers like this, when it's first starting to bolt, if you cut the stem and peel back the outer, not bark, but outer layer, the inner stem tastes a lot like artichoke, can be cooked as you would cook artichoke, which is kind of interesting. It sprouts March to April, flowers May to June, and then seeds August to October. So you'll start seeing burrs of these guys now. In the first year, it, like I said, is usually just this kind of rhubarb looking plant. And then in the second year, it'll bolt up. The next one we have here is common tansy. So this one has 20 to 200 yellow to orange button-like flowers in these really dense clusters called an umbel. It's not too tall, it's about 30 centimeters, can get up to like 1.5 meters tall in the stem, but the stem is really skinny and woody. It has these alternating leaves that are fern-like, kind of frayed out. And the leaves stay consistent all the way up the plant. And then the last one I have here is sulfur cinquefoil. So sulfur cinquefoil invades grasslands, dry open forests, and disturbed sites. I'll see this one a lot along trails that I'm walking on. It's really small and low to the ground. A single plant can produce up to 1,600 seeds, and they live up to 20 years as new shoots can emerge from the main root. They have these 5 heart-shaped petals on these flowers, on their flowers, and the leaves are divided into kind of a palm-looking, like almost like a pot leaf. They have these toothed leaflets. These plants look a lot like our native cinquefoil. It's called graceful cinquefoil. But our native cinquefoil is shorter, and it has white woolly hair on the underside of the leaves. So if you see leaves that look like this and you look underneath them, there's these little white hairs on them. It might be our native cinquefoil. Otherwise, it's probably sulfur cinquefoil, which is invasive. Awesome, that's the end of my presentation. I just want to say thank you so much for being here and taking some time out of your day to learn a little bit about invasive species. My email is there if you want to contact me, and our website is there if you want to learn a little bit more about what we do in invasive species. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And if you have any questions for me, you're welcome to put them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask away. Otherwise, thanks so much for being here and taking some time out with me. And I hope that you learned a little bit. Thanks.